So by the end of this week, I want to do like let's say like a experimental diagnosis of how people who are interested in arts and culture in Toluca feel about exhibition spaces. So the idea is that during this week I'll be doing a questionnaire that's going to be divided into three areas, and each area will have 20 questions. So it's going to be, well, quite a long questionnaire, but hopefully people will be, glad to just come over and answer whatever is on the questionnaire. So this is going to be done very similarly to what Kate Crawford and Maral Pusarkemi did with 9 questions. I don't know if you know that artwork. I think, yeah.
I love that project. It's inspired by Jenny Holzer's truisms,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so that the truisms work, and Meryl and Kate's work inspired some of the work that Hyphen Labs and I did around networks.
Yeah, well, basically my let's say like the questionnaire structure physically is gonna work like 9 questions in space, right? So of course the content is gonna be, well, way much more into like a research methodology rather than an artwork in itself. But I feel very strongly about that work particularly, and of course everything that comes from Jenny Holzer's truisms, because I think it's a very engaging way of actually making a point or asking or like opening up for conversation. So what I did yesterday, or what I started doing yesterday, is that in 2018 I started working with the collective Kaken from the UK on what we called the unfinished antithesis to the white cube. So
Right. Oh, cool.
it's around 48, let's say like short statements about what the future of the white cube shouldn't be like. So it's very much inspired by the antithesis of cyberfeminism, but also, let's say we wanted to be a little bit of, flexible in the sense that we felt that a manifesto is always telling you what something is, rather than what something shouldn't be. So what we wanted to do was
Right.
basically that, saying what does this exhibition space of the future shouldn't be perpetuating from what happens currently. So it's basically, like a small list of a series of approaches, such as it shouldn't be unisensorial, it shouldn't be unidimensional, it shouldn't be boring, it should be flat, it shouldn't be, like disengaging from reality, and so forth. So this, I translated this and I published this yesterday as a way of starting the conversation about this. So what I'd like to talk with you about is, basically, how do you feel towards the notion of, let's say, the museum of the future, museum not that much as an structure, rather than an institution that shows art, right? So what I don't want to do in this project is that I don't want to do this like very, very site specific in terms of the questions, because I want people to grab these questions and use them in their own context. So what I did is I created 3 main areas. These 3 main areas are everything regarding climate change.
Okay.
On one hand, and all the questions around sustainability. How can it give life to its own ecosystem? How can it be non-violent towards the extraction of natural resources, and everything that deals also with like a space for multi-species, a multi-species approach.
Right.
Then the other area that I have is institutional critique. that deals with roles of power and the structure and the notion of the museum in itself, its histories and its limitations. And then I have what I've been calling advanced practices, which I am basically trying to build a case for talking about everything about approaches, methodologies, and exhibition making in regards to diversity, accessibility, and creating a a secure space, a safe space. Sorry. So yeah, those are my three key areas. I mean, I am very much aware that 20 questions per area are not going to be enough. However, I want to be able to approach what could be the key questions, because after this diagnosis is done, or after this questionnaire is exhibited, the idea would be to present these results in an open dialogue with both the people that came over and let's say voted and did the questionnaire, but also representatives from other institutions, especially museums and galleries, so that we can discuss these questions. So
Totally.
up until this point, I think that I have, let's say, like a core 5 to 10 questions that I will locate afterwards. But what I've been trying to do is to listen to other art professionals that are engaging with these topics, especially in terms of accessibility, safe spaces, and diversity, to listen to what their thoughts are towards this, and hopefully to have a broader, let's say, a broader sense, and not only to be like, just closed into my own way of approaching these ideas.
Right.
So yeah, that's basically it.
So, I mean, I think that these are really great things to bring up. One thing that comes to mind is the Tate Modern has sort of made like a stance on what they're calling the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that is like an emphasis on not flying people. Sorry.
Yep.
Really loud. I thought I could like sit outside and be fine. So the Tate Modern has like made, and I think that Tate in general has sort of made an emphasis on like trying to reduce their own carbon footprint and recognizing that we're in a time of a climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that means like not flying people in, right? Or even having them get on trains. It's really like, can we show the work without you being there? What are like more sustainable alternatives? I think one thing that's sort of important to highlight is because they are the Tate, smaller institutions may have a harder time with that. For example, if you're trying to get someone to come to a talk, having the artist there, physically there, is a big draw, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas if a much smaller institution is like, oh, well, we'll just do Skype, that may like backfire for them. But I think it's incredibly interesting when conferences and institutions realize we're in a time of a climate crisis, and start to make steps to minimize their own carbon footprint. A good step being, so like the Tate Late, for example, isn't really like bringing anyone in unless they're in, I think, a certain radius. But I think, even going even further, I think that there are so many practices institutions could do. How sustainable is it to switch to, green energy? How sustainable is it to even think about the artworks, if it's tech art, if it's running, how sustainable is that piece of work? Even what's the sustainability of shipping things? So what comes to mind, is Oliver, is it Elkin's work? He shipped a piece of an iceberg to have it sort of melt, I think, in Brussels. But the carbon footprint of that piece is so large that it really overshadows what he's trying to say, right? With the piece, it really overshadows the fact whatever he's trying to emphasize on sustainability, because that piece is so not sustainable,
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's definitely a conversation to be had, both, I mean, in the sense of approaching any sort of these topics, because there's also this thing about, for instance, being very interested in talking about decolonization, but then also having, a decolonization panel where you only have like white people talking about decolonization, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think sometimes it is not something that feels 100% honest, like, and I am
Right.
not judging at all, the let's say the objectives they have towards these sort of activities. I am very much aware that these topics about, decolonization, diversity, climate change, accessibility, it's definitely something that concerns all of us. But then at the
Yeah.
same time, we especially in these art institutions, let's say, I think that have a very hard time understanding all of the implications of the activities they do around these topics.
Totally. I mean, this is kind of where I struggle, and I always like to check my own privilege because, like, if, when I think about an all-white panel, for example, in Germany on decolonization, or on Afrofuturism, that's absurd to me when some of the best, artists who are people of color are unpacking that and they live in Berlin, like Louisa Prada.
Yeah.
Amazing, right? She comes to mind. And now, like, Ash Bacchus Clark, who was with Hyphen Labs, is now starting their own, artistic practice there in Berlin. So it's crazy to me that, like, for example, in a very specific example, that there would be an overwhelmingly white show on Afrofuturism when some of the best artists who cover this are in Germany. That being said, I always wonder about, like, if a really small town, let's say in Mexico or Louisiana or in Italy, and it's a very small institution, they have almost no budget, and they want to do something on climate change, like, who is available for them to bring in, right?
Yeah.
And that is where I think, like, I think that's where we should, like, sort of lean back as like activators and researchers, like, lean back on that skill. The thing I love about curatorial practices is that curators are, like, very amazing researchers and planners, and so, on these panels, maybe you don't need, like, the leading scientist on it, but there most likely is someone nearby or someone that you can put on a bus or a train to come in and talk about it. And that's also where Skype is helpful. So I think, like, this is where, again, like, being a researcher is important. I think a lot about Tatiana Busnelli, who runs Disruption Lab Network in New York. She always finds, in Berlin, Disruption Lab Network. She always finds the most interesting people to cover topics who are experts, but they're also not the usual experts you see on panels.
Yeah.
And I love that she clearly spends a lot of time with her staff, like, thinking about that, and really thinking about, like, who's speaking and who's covering, like, which different topics. And I'm trying to think, like, so I always sort of reflect back on that, which is, like, as curators or organizers, I speak as a researcher and an artist. There is always, like, someone that's covering the topic you're interested in that is, a person of color. And they're, massive experts. Like, there are scientists and policymakers and well-known artists who are doing that. And so I often think, whenever I see, like, an all-white panel, it's just not someone trying hard enough,
Yeah.
Or when I see, like, an all-white and male panel, I'm like, you just didn't try. Like, you spent, like, 5 minutes on this. And I think I would like to see an emphasis more like a framework of like this, like putting together the panel should take a little bit of time. It shouldn't just be something off the cuff. And because if it's off the cuff, the quality is lower. It's gonna be the same people having the same conversations, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that that's something that we should reflect upon also while talking about, topics that that feel particularly that there aren't much ways out, right? So I think, for example, in Toluca, what happens a lot is that it's an industrial city, right? So it is a city that, let's say, most of the people who live here are medium class engineers, most of them working in a very, like very close by to their houses, most of them working for, let's say, like Volkswagen or Ford or, like big brands, particularly from companies from the US, who then again also speak English because of this. And, there's a very particular atmosphere to this in Toluca. And there's, of course, this other side of saying, it's also very close to Mexico City. So on one hand, people who live here feel like they don't have any, let's say, like any stance on art and culture because we are an industrial city. And if we want to be participant or be part of the arts and culture circuit, we have to go to Mexico City, which is not at all far. However, the discourses are very, very different. And this is also something that feels, that happens over and over while seeing, for instance, the exhibitions that are being held in Mexico City, or the panels, or who wins the scholarships, or who wins, the grants. And it feels like there's a strange situation in which a lot of people that currently live here feel that in order to make it in arts and culture, they have to move to Mexico City. However, Mexico City is already a place that has more than 20 million inhabitants. Toluca has nearly 1 million. So, there are other ways of approaching this. And I think it would be very interesting to know also your opinion on this, on how these inequality and inaccessibility, sometimes it comes from a specific ideology of the things that you feel like you're supposed to be doing in order to be part of something, like as in, if I am a researcher and I'm talking about decolonization and I live in a very small town, where not a lot of people is interested in these topics, or there aren't enough spaces for me to cover these research, maybe, it feels like the most sensible idea sometimes it is to move away, to be like, oh, where is people talking about, or where are people talking about these topics, is it Berlin, is it London, is it New York? Then I might as well try and go there. Of course, it happens as well locally, and in this sense, I'm not sure if you've ever been, in a situation where you've had to make these sort of decisions for your own career.
Right. I definitely have. I moved to Berlin for my career. And I think a lot of this is like, we were talking about this a few days earlier. I find as an artist, an artist and designer that in North America, and as you've pointed out, in Central America, art and design are viewed as like radically different things, but they're not different to me. And I think you can use the language of product design in a specific way to sort of like challenge and create interesting spaces.
Yeah.
And for me, when I think about like a social justice practice and art and design practice, and how like the white cube can exist within that, that's where design and art can come together. So I think about some of these weird wireframes that I'm making that maybe like 10 or 15 years from now, they could be shown. How would they be shown? Where could they be shown? They could be shown in a gallery.
Yeah.
They could be shown in a museum. They don't have to just be shown in a graphic design museum.
Yeah.
And so and I think about them as like actuators or pushes. They may not be as speculative as like other pieces, but they are still, I think, pieces of work and art and design And the reason I like sort of emphasize all of this is in the US in particular, I have often felt this weird pressure to evangelize and sort of argue or debate that my practice can be both design and art. I never have that debate or argument in Europe. Like I never have it. People are like, no, we totally get it. We get it. Like, so if I'm like, but they're both, they're like, yes, we agree with you.
Yeah.
What else? And so for me, a lot of it has been much more fruitful moving to another place, because like, and moving to a place where historically, like my practice is better understood, that really sort of radically opened up doors for me. But it's hard. I don't think most people can do that. And I don't think the solution should be, you know, if you're like an arts and graphics designer who's interested in social justice, you should move to Europe. Like, that's not sustainable, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I think this is sort of where, like, I don't have a solution, but what I would love to see is like a coalition of like other artists or curators or researchers who are maybe interested in the topics like I'm interested in, for example, of sort of saying like, we're going to hold space continually. Like, maybe another example that brings closer to what you were talking about is like, I also left New Orleans to move to New York.
Yeah.
And like, that was way better for my art career. And even now, I would argue with like this really big CV I still have a hard time making any traction at all in New Orleans, even though I have like a very professional artistic and design CV. I find it extremely difficult to make any headway with galleries or, you know, curatorial spaces or like artistic institutions. And a lot of that is, I think there's just like a lack of context for what I do. And so that sort of paints me as an outsider to the place I grew up in, sort of says that there's not a space for me. Yeah. So a lot of that has been, as an artist, I've had to go like where the space is for me, which is its own kind of heartbreak.
Of course. Would you say that, because this is a conversation that particularly within arts and technology is, you know, on the utopic side, that talks about how the internet in a way provided a way of doing these sort of exchanges without moving to other places or without having to travel long distances. And of course, I mean, now we are very much aware about the problems with these utopia, but would you say, or would you think that probably there should be a lot more to do within their own structure and using the own structure of the internet to sort out some of these issues? Or would you say it should be within a different logic or a different structure than the one that we have with the internet in itself currently?
I think the answer, you know, as enigmatic as it sounds, is yes to both of your questions. So I think in the future, I hope that like in 10 years, like the first part of your question of like, can we sort of use the internet to build these coalitions and build all of these things without having to physically be or move to another city could happen. I very much believe that because I also think that's the dream, like the dream of the early internet, right?
Yeah.
But I think right now, like this is where the work you're doing is so important, and like the work that like what I can ask as an artist is important, where I can say like, actually, I would love a participatory element to my project when it's installed somewhere that invites artists from these different locations without physically having to be in the room, you know? And I think that's where a curator can say, like, what we're interested in is thinking about how we can bring the actual, like, communication, like digital communication into the space more, and thus have artists from other places who are not here be here in a way. And so that goes beyond just installing their work. That may mean instead of holding a talk in the gallery or in the museum or cultural center, that we have like a digital one, right? Yeah. And we can have like 100 people in this talk with like 3 artists like giving it. And this way, like you could have like a totally distributed sort of like online meetup, you know?
Yeah.
And I think like now thinking of, because the way I think about stuff also as an artist and a researcher, like I write a lot of grants. And I know sometimes for grants, there are like expectations you do X, right? Like you need to show something.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are things we can start to set up now that can become best practices in the next few years, while still recognizing that we're trapped into like a very capitalistic and grant giving space, which often means as creators and researchers and artists, we have to give people something, right? Like we have to give them a thing for what they're paying for. So I'm trying to think about like what are like practical things we can do now. So like if there is a talk where it's like, great, well we are going to, or there is like a thing, we're going to install work. Cool,
Mm-hmm.
right? A donor or a grant giving body, like a grantor can see, like a funder can see, yes, when I give X amount of money, this artwork's going to get installed, and then maybe they're curating this thing, and then of course they're asking for extra budget to do things like an artist talk.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like instead of doing like an artist talk, a physical artist talk and a physical workshop, one of those things now can be online, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we all started doing that and asking for that now, then that sets it up to be a norm in a few years where it's not a crazy ask. Like, does that make sense? Like, I think we can think about sustainable practices now and really actively put them into like our projects now. And when it becomes a norm, it means we've shifted, right? We've like shifted what we think of as a norm, and we can keep shifting further and further and further.
Yeah. And I think that's also one of the things, right? Because it's not like we don't have the tools in order for us to be able to do these, let's say, conversations through the internet, or even doing all of the logistics behind an exhibition through the internet. However, it still feels, let's say, in a broader sense, that a lot of these choices are less significant than the ones being done physically. And I think that's definitely something we have to overcome, especially in the face of climate change, right? Because
Totally.
this is also one of the things that I think could expand into other conversations about diversity and accessibility as well, because then you don't really need to have someone that is physically living there for you to have a very interesting panel about whatever topic you choose, being much more open and diverse, being able to just interconnect these people through the web. And I think that one of the reasons why people just don't do that is because it doesn't feel as valid as, right? So, which is definitely something that I find interesting now that you're talking also about grants and about expectations when someone provides you with a certain budget to do a particular project or to develop a particular research. It's always a case of thinking about how having a printed book or having a panel with everyone physically present still feels much more compelling than having an EPUB. And even if people is going to download that in a faster, better distributed way, right? So I think it's an interesting conversation also to think about the validation of such practices within the internet.
No, I totally agree, and that's where I wonder, like, sorry,
It's okay.
I'm trying to walk into a quiet place. This is where I think, like, I love Maurice Aliari's and Daniel Rourke's The 3D Atavist Cookbook, because they designed it in a way that, like, you can't print that,
Mm-hmm.
And they've designed it in a way where it's, like, anti-physical.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think exactly like what you're highlighting is like, the internet is viewed as less. And this is like so historically true when we look back at the history of media online. So for example, I used to study fashion bloggers because I think they're a great example of the downfall of American print, especially with fashions.
Mm-hmm.
So like the sartorialists, people like, hold on one sec.
Yep.
like walking inside to a quieter place. So the sartorialists, people like Susie Bubble, granted, who's based in London, but like the street peeper,
Yeah.
all of these people, like Brian Boy, they became super, super famous. And they, without having to sort of like climb up the gilded tower of fashion, even though one could argue all the people I've mentioned are quite privileged, and like Susie already worked, for example, in fashion, they're able to disrupt it. And one thing that really comes to mind to me is the sartorialist, who I actually hate his artwork, but I love this quote as an example. He talks about how on his blog, like, he was making like affiliate advertising. Or not affiliate advertising. He was making money from like digital ads, but that his ads at a certain point, because he got so popular, American Apparel started paying him the amount that they would pay for print ads. So the reason I bring this up is like digital ads were always like priced less than a physical ad, right? And I think this is an example of like things on the internet being worth less than things being printed being worth more, if that makes sense. That like, even when we look at the financial models, like the gross parts of the internet, that like it's still, you know, actually like compared to a physical model is less, right? And I feel like that is changing now slightly, but it's just, you know, it's just like digital things are not, you know, are not viewed as the price point isn't as higher. And I think it's interesting when I see digital artists then make things that are like more traditional media. So like when they make a sculpture, you know, for example, instead of an interactive net art piece, or when they choose to make a video or a series of photographs, right? That have to be printed or have to be installed in a certain way over, like, you know, over something else. I always find it really interesting.
Yeah, and that also comes back to, you know, other ways of creating or building economic growth for the cultural circuit in general, because of course we have to, I mean, if we're talking about accessibility and privilege and you know, of course, diversity, sometimes we come back to this conversation about how someone cannot really be an artist unless you are already someone who has money and a certain degree of privilege. So I think sometimes, you know, what happens within digital arts is that a lot of these digital artists found a way for them to be part of a circuit that they couldn't be part of any other way. And, you know, in terms of building their own careers, I mean, it's definitely something that they have to think about, you know, especially if they're interested into eventually getting inside the art market, and how does this art market understands what they are doing. And then again, you know, it comes back, like you say, to this validation of what is more important than what. And I think that the main problem there is that we are missing the point of what is important or what makes or gives something value, right? So, you know, when you have something that is a unique event or a unique piece or a unique exhibition that it's very, very much site specific and that you can only experience in that particular way, in this case physically, it also creates, you know, this aura, to go back to Benjamin, of privilege, of being able to access something that not everyone can access to, you know, whether that be buying a painting that it's a unique piece and no one else can access to this, or whether that be a talk or an exhibition. And I think it is interesting now to see that there's a lot of other things that we are giving value to, like, for instance, virality, right? When something is out there and becomes more important in the, you know, due to the fact that it has been shared broadly on the internet. So, yeah, I think it's I don't know, it's an interesting conversation to I don't know, to be having currently, you know, after 30 years of the World Wide Web.
Totally. I think, I mean, this is one thing where I wonder, and I would love to see this sort of brought up in your research. I may have to go in a second, actually. But I would love to hear people's thoughts on thinking about, in terms of the climate crisis, how can we think not just about travel of artists, but like prioritizing the ephemeral, like digital art, for example, and how can we prioritize like digital communications and elevate it to a space of interaction where it doesn't have to be viewed as this second tier thing. Because I feel like right now what people are doing is they're like, well, you know, like this wasn't our intended medium, but like in an age really of coronavirus, like a human rights conference I'm going to just got canceled, you know, some of us are being like, well, you know, having us travel from, you know, Pakistan, India, even across Europe, from Mexico, from Brazil to this conference, like that's a big footprint. That's a really big, like ecological footprint. And we had already started conversations about webinars anyway. And now this pandemic of disease is what is actually forcing us to really, I think, now's a good time to think about ecological damage. So maybe, what I'm thinking about is maybe now is the perfect time to say, let's just try digital conferences instead. Now that like the idea that it is really, really like the danger is very immediate, right? Coronavirus is like an immediate danger, whereas ecological collapse is like a long-term danger. You know, like we're not going to see the ice caps melting tomorrow, but like I could in 5 seconds contract coronavirus, right? So that's kind of what I've been wondering or thinking about, is how can we create these alternatives that don't feel like second-class alternatives, but artistic choices. And some of that, you know, when I think about human rights and internet freedom, like those are things we should already be doing in our practice. And then I also feel that especially as artists.
No, definitely. And this should be or will be a key part while talking about climate change, definitely. And I will definitely let you know what people think about this. And of course, I'd like to share with you before Saturday, that's when the event is going to be held, all of the questions just for you to have a sense of what we'll be working on here. And well, thank you so much for your time again.
Yeah, thank you. It was great talking to you.
Oh, it's always great talking to you too. Well, I'm going to start recording now. And thank you so much. And